Welcome to Soccer Spender. Let's talk about one of the most confusing, most debated, and, let's be honest, one of the most ridiculous sports naming dilemmas of all time. If you've ever found yourself wondering why Americans call it soccer while the rest of the world calls it football, or why American football is nothing like what Europeans call football, then you're not alone. And here's the real kicker. What Europeans call rugby is actually way more similar to what Americans call football. Confused? Oh, trust me, it gets better. Now, let's just address the elephant in the room. The sport that the world knows as football is called football for a reason. It is played primarily with the feet. The ball is kicked, passed, and controlled using footwork. And the objective is to put the ball in the net using precision and skill. It is a game of fluidity, strategy, and continuous play. There are no timeouts, no commercial breaks every few seconds, and no weird stoppages just because someone got lightly touched. It's pure, raw sport. It's the beautiful game. Yet, somehow, the United States decided to take that beautiful game and give it a completely different name, soccer. And if that wasn't bad enough, they took a sport where the ball is barely kicked, mostly carried, thrown, or tackled, and decided that was worthy of the name football. Make it make sense. A sport where massive men in helmets and pads spend most of the game running into each other, stopping every few seconds and following plays drawn up like military strategies was somehow given the name football. Meanwhile, the sport that actually involves feet on the ball was downgraded to soccer. It's almost as if the US looked at the rest of the world and said, nah, we're going to do things our own way, just to be difficult. But here's the wild part. Americans didn't even invent the word soccer. That's right, the British did. The term comes from association football, which was shortened to ASOC football, and eventually became soccer. It was a slang term used in England long before Americans adopted it. In fact, for a while, the British used both football and soccer interchangeably. But as time passed, football became the dominant term across Europe and the rest of the world, while the US held on to soccer because they had already given the name football to their own sport. So, the next time an English fan mocks an American for saying soccer, remind them that they're the ones who invented the word in the first place. Now let's add another layer to this madness. What Europeans call rugby is actually much closer to American football than what Americans call football. Rugby involves an oval-shaped ball, intense physicality, and players smashing into each other at full speed. The only real difference: rugby players don't wear helmets and body armor. They take those brutal hits like absolute warriors, while American football players suit up in more protective gear than a soldier going into battle. Yet, for some reason, nobody in the US calls rugby football. Instead, they insist on calling their highly commercialized, stop-and-start, strategy-driven game football, despite it being played mostly with hands. And let's be honest, American football is barely even a sport at times. It's more of a television event. The average NFL game lasts over 3 hours, but if you break it down, there are only about 11 minutes of actual gameplay. The rest? Commercials, timeouts, huddles, and replays. Compare that to football, real football, where the game flows continuously and players don't get a break every 5 seconds. In football, you have to be physically and mentally locked in for 90 straight minutes, constantly making plays, reading the game, and adapting on the fly. In American football, you run a play, stop, talk about the next play, run another play, stop again, watch a commercial, rinse and repeat. And somehow, that's the game they call football? But let's not pretend soccer fans don't have their own issues with American influence. For years, Americans have dismissed football, real football, as a boring sport, claiming there's not enough scoring or action. Meanwhile, they'll watch an NFL game where teams spend half the time just standing around. And now that the sport is finally gaining popularity in the US, they're trying to claim it like they've been fans all along. The same country that called it a soft sport now suddenly has die-hard Premier League and Champions League fans popping up everywhere. Convenient timing, right? And let's not forget the Americanization of football culture. Over-the-top goal celebrations, VAR controversies, and constant debates about turning it into a more commercialized spectacle. But here's where things get even more ironic. Despite decades of trying to downplay football, the US is now investing heavily in the sport. Major League Soccer, MLS, is growing. European leagues are drawing massive American audiences, and the US even landed the 2026 World Cup alongside Canada and Mexico. So here's the big question. Will Americans ever start calling it football like the rest of the world? Or will they stay stubborn just to be different? And what about American football? Should it even be called football at all? If a game is mostly played with hands, shouldn't it be called handball? Or something else entirely? Would Americans freak out if the rest of the world started calling their sport American rugby instead of football? Maybe then they'd understand the confusion. Let's settle this once and for all. Should Americans finally start calling football by its real name? Or do they get a free pass since the British technically invented the word soccer in the first place? And should American football be renamed to something more accurate? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this debate isn't going away anytime soon.